Okay, so thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight for this webinar. We're here with Alan Kessler at the moment from the Historic Divers Society, who is going to take us through the history of some of this amazing diving equipment that you can see in front of you on this video. Just a little bit about Alan before we start. Alan has been diving for over 46 years and is a PADI dive master and now is standard dress diver. He has been diving regularly since 1992 and enjoys underwater photography. While not into technical diving, his interest in the history of diving has gotten him more into diving in some very unusual gear, including what you might call a tri-dive of a military Draeger rebreather. Is that right, Alan?
Yep.
Draeger? Yeah, beautiful. History really interests Alan. In the early 2000s, he joined the Historic Divers Society, or the organization that is now the Historic Divers Society, Diving Society, I apologize, Australia Pacific. And after a few years, he joined the committee and became the organizer for New South Wales, including organizing events such as their presence at Oztech. After retiring from full-time work in 2011, he took over the position of Honorary Secretary of the Society and still fulfills that voluntary position today. He's got a whole host of vintage dive gear there, and as you can see from this video right here behind him. So what we've actually got is we've set it up on two screens, one that allows you to see the room with everything, but also Alan's popped his phone up as well so that he can actually do close-ups there of all the gear. And what we're going to do is basically hand it over to him and let him run you through and do a bit more of an introduction. So Alan, I'm going to mute myself. Thank you so much for coming along, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Carmen. Just before I introduce the topic, I'm just going to introduce a colleague of mine as soon as I can. Right. My camera doesn't want to change. My camera doesn't want to change to the front camera. Well, we practice, Carmen, and it still doesn't work.
That's okay. I think you have it, but it might have a little bit of a delay. So if you just press it across one more time, it is going back and forth.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. It wasn't.
No, that's okay.
Not showing on my own screen.
Not a problem.
So at the moment you can see me, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll press it once. And
there you go. Now you're good. Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Right. So let me introduce Stanley Haviland. He's one of my friends and colleagues from Historical Diving Society Australia Pacific. And Stanley's going to point the things tonight so that I can stand back and get a better picture with the camera. So just pan around the room for a second. You can see helmets. I've actually got 25 brass and copper helmets, accessories, which we'll talk about, more modern gear, scuba gear. I'm a bit in awe that we've got a commercial diver and a military diver here, so you'll probably know more about this than me, and some vintage scuba gear. So we'll just run through all of that in turn. Now just let me flick the camera over. So going from left to right here, we actually have what's commonly known as deep sea diving helmets, and there's a number of them which I'll cover off in a minute. And over on the right hand side we have some shallow water helmets. So originally diving started with the deep sea helmets back around the 1840s, and later on the shallow water helmets were introduced. The third one from the left there, the simpler looking one, was made from the 1920s, and the second from the left was from the same company. They made another model in between, and then that one being their third. So the three on the right were brass and copper helmets, and the one on the left, the black one, is cast iron. So with a shallow water helmet, what they're designed for is working in up to 10 meters or so of water. They simply sit on your shoulders. You wear, well, nowadays you probably wear a wetsuit. In the old days, people would wear clothes or something like that, just working gear, and they would maybe use them to clean the bottom of hulls of boats or things like that. the of course, with helmets, they actually contain a lot of air, and so they're typically buoyant. So you'll see there that I have, this one's a little bit in the way, sorry, but you'll see there are 2 sets of weights. The third one, the one in the middle, has a set of weights as well, but it's not shown. So you add a lot of lead to counteract that buoyancy. The one on the left, being cast iron, in fact has enough weight of its own to counteract the buoyancy. So these are all surface supplied. In other words, the air is being pumped down from the surface in some way or another. And the way that you can use is a very simple pump like this one. There, the hand pump and 2 pistons at the bottom, which would have leather cups and pump the air out. They were quite common sort of pump in the early 1900s, and they were used for all sorts of things like pumping beer and other things as well. So there's not an awful lot to say about the shallow water helmets, because it's pretty much as I said. They sit on your shoulders, the air comes down from the surface, it bubbles out around your shoulders, and you just breathe with it in there. One of the reasons for the limit on the depth, of course, is because it's open. The deeper you go, the less air will be in there. It'll be compressed more and more until it's actually above your mouth and nose and you can't breathe. So that's why there is a depth limit on the use of those. As I said, the third one from the left there, I really love that helmet. It's just so simple. It was made by a company called Miller Dunn, and Miller and Dunn are 2 surnames. I can't remember which off the top of my head, but one of them was, in fact, I think a boat owner who wanted something to work on his boat. And the other one was a plumber. And I think that's where this design comes from. So it's very simple. The vertical cylinder is just rolled copper, and it's actually joined by a seam down the back. So it's been started as a flat piece of copper rolled, joined by a seam, and then the shoulders have been shaped and the edges rolled at the bottom. May not be too clear to you, but I can see that quite clearly from here. And there's a dome on the top and a single piece of glass at the front. The fitting on that is very much like it's a tap fitting sort of thing you could screw a tap fitting onto. So very, very simple. And then they went from there to, say, the second from the left, much more complicated looking, but really didn't do anything much else. It's got more windows in it, and that's pretty much the main difference. For helmets, some people call them windows, some people call them ports. Technically, they're called lights, presumably because they let the light in. So that's pretty much all I've got to say about the shallow water helmets. I'm going to move on to the deep sea helmets, which obviously Oliver and so on know more about. So we're just going to take a quick pan across here. The 2 on the left have a distinguishing feature of having 3 bolts. So you'll see a nut and bolt type attachment on these, and all deep water helmets should have nuts and bolts. And the Europeans and the Russians typically use that format of 3 bolts. So the one on the left is in fact German helmet, and the second from the left is the Russian helmet. I think you mentioned before, Oliver, something about Russian helmet. So they are with 3 bolts. Then going along, the English and Americans, they mainly used a 12-bolt type setup, and Australia followed England. So looking in a little more closely, this one, this is a US Navy Mark V helmet. They created a standard for their Navy divers around about 1916, and they used that right through to mid-80s. It was used in parallel with more modern gear at the time, but it was still in use. Then moving over, we have the English helmets, and the one here, which I'll just go in a little bit. So the one on the left of these 2 is really what I consider the iconic helmet. I'll probably use that word a couple of times. Back when I sort of started getting into these, I actually envisaged a helmet like that. I didn't know there were actually so many variations. There's one collector in the US, I've been to his house, and he had, when I went in the early 2000s, he had 288 different helmets. And I think he has more now, but yeah, it's just a staggering difference. So of the two there, the one on the left and one on the right, they're both made by a company called C.B. Gorman, which was the leading English manufacturer of helmets. They actually started making them around the 1840s, and they actually called standard dress for this system of these helmets. And as far as I know, it's quite simple that it was standardized, because prior to that, well, there wasn't a lot at all. They weren't really mass produced, and there was no standardization. So with this company, you were able to order helmets in some variations, but things like the bolts and nuts, the nuts would fit different helmets, and bits and pieces were interchangeable. So they became a standard. The one on the right is a 6-bolt, and that format was adopted by the Royal Navy and subsequently the Royal Australian Navy, simply because with less nuts to do up and less pieces of brass to put on, they were actually quicker and easier to dress the diver into the gear. So that was the standard for that Navy. Just lastly, I'm going to show the one on the right here. And this one is actually made by Roberson, which were coppersmiths in Australia. They started in the 1800s, and they were making all sorts of things, including things like steam engines and so on, that coppersmiths in back of those days made. And what happened was, during World War II, there was a shortage of helmets, and we couldn't really get any from the UK anymore. So a company over there called Heinke, which was actually later, they were a competitor of C.B. Gorman. I mentioned a moment ago C.B. Gorman being the other ones to the left of this helmet. They were a competitor of theirs, but later acquired by C.B. Gorman. But they had Roberson as a distributor in Australia, and during the war they said, okay, well, you can make, here's the pattern, you can make helmets and sell them in Australia. So this is the only helmet that was mass produced, when I say mass produced, in Australia ever. And as far as we know, there's no more than about 70 made. We have numbers up to around about 50, a fair few numbers of helmets still in existence with the serial number, but we have only 1 or 2 which actually are above that number. We think 70 might have been the top number. They were made for a couple of reasons. One is for pearling, and that's a distinctive feature of this helmet, where the bottom of the breastplate part here is actually flatter than the other ones, and the window or light, as you can see, quite between those two, the one on the left, the C.B. Gorman, the light is looking straight out, square to the helmet. This one is looking down. The reason being is, if you're pearling, you want to walk along the bottom, watching in front of you for pearl shell, and then pick them up, put them in your bag. Whereas if you're using one of these types of helmets, what you're doing is some sort of work, whether it's for the military or commercial. So you want to look straight out front and see what you're doing. It could be welding or cutting or something, wrapping a pile, cleaning a hull, whatever it is. So that's a significant difference between those two types of helmet. This helmet is extremely heavy because of the bottom part, called the breastplate, is cast brass, whereas these ones were copper and just brass straps. So it's a lot heavier than those other helmets. That helmet is actually got a serial number of number 3, which makes it the oldest known helmet in Australia. Number 2 belongs to the collector I mentioned earlier with the 288 helmets in the US. He had number 2. That's the oldest known one. We don't know whatever happened to number 1. Who knows? Could have been scrapped because it wasn't quite right, or could have been kept by the office for a while till they went out of business. Don't know. Maybe it just wasn't numbered because it was the first one. Anyway, the helmets were made for either commercial work like pearling, or there was a batch, made for the Commonwealth government. And we know that there was an organisation called the Commonwealth Salvage Board, which was only set up in World War II to handle salvaging of ships vessels, and they actually ordered some. So we know from a biography of the person in charge of that department that they had some, but we don't really know exactly where everyone went. There's one on display up in Broome in a museum, and there are some. There's another one in Victoria, which was owned by the Melbourne Ports Authority. So again, there was a bit of government there and pearling, and that's really the main use of them. Just going to go over now quickly and look at the components of a helmet, and this is where Stanley's going to point things out for me. We've got, basically, I've already mentioned the lights, the windows, and typically they're 3 or 4. Occasional one, like some of the shallow water helmets, might be a single light. We have the brails, and the purpose of the brail is a brass strap, and using the bolts and nuts, the suit or dress is the rubber collar of that is placed between that, and that's screwed down to create a waterproof seal. I'll show you a dress in a moment. So that's another feature, and that really distinguishes the deep sea helmets from the shallow water helmets. Moving to this side a little bit, we have a spitcock, and as Stanley's showing, it's basically like a little water valve. The purpose of the spitcock was, in the position that it is now, it was closed, and if you want to open it, you did that, and you could, well, the diver could put their mouth to it before they opened it, and they could actually take in some seawater, and they could use that, they could spray that with their mouth onto the inside of the front light, which would be in case it was fogging up. I've done that myself. Sometimes they do get a bit foggy in there. On this side, we have the exhaust valve, and the exhaust valve is adjustable, so it regulates the amount of air going out of the helmet. So just remembering that these are surface supplied, so you've got somebody at the surface pumping in one way or another. With the deep sea ones, not a little pump like I showed you before, but they were hand pumps, but they were like, 75 kilos sort of type weight.
And the non-return valve is very important too.
Yeah, get to that.
Yes.
So that would provide a steady stream of air, but the diver would need to adjust the air. And in the CB Gorman system, they really only did that by adjusting the outflow, with the surface supplying the air that they needed. The one thing that we have used in Australia for our diving is this concept of the whip and the belly valve. So when we actually dive these, and this helmet here I'm showing you is actually one that I dive, it's working. We have added this whip, and that attaches to the surface supply. So that allows the diver to adjust the airflow in. Now that was not a standard feature of this helmet, but it was a standard feature of the American helmet I showed you before, and also the Asian helmets, they used to use them as well. So we use it because it's just great to give the diver more control. We move around to the back of the helmet. It's really only 2 things to look at. One is the air, where the air goes in, and as Stanley mentioned, up at that joint, there is actually a non-return valve. So the purpose of that was if, for instance, the hose were cut, broken or something like that, or the pump was broken and the air could flow backwards, if there was no non-return valve, you would suffer a very severe squeeze and probably death if you were deep enough. I don't know if anybody's seen the Mythbusters recreation of that, where it's, was treated as a myth that a diver could be squeezed up into the helmet, which is some sort of legends from the pearl diving and so on. And they actually proved that it was possible, and they did that using a pig carcass. So if you haven't seen that and you're interested, I'd suggest go on YouTube, have a search for that, and you'll find that. The other thing just below the air, there is a comms inlet, and we've actually used a modern diving wire, which is a 2-pin. I know that mostly commercial use four, and our commercial diving buddies that I mentioned before, who are members, keep saying we should use four, but basically some of our members started out using two, and now we all do two because that actually just makes us compatible, and we can plug our helmet into somebody else's comm system. And likewise, we all pretty much use the Chinese whip and the teamer fittings, and we can just all plug into each other's gear. So they're the main features of the helmet. You'll see a couple of other things on the side lights. We've got a grille simply to protect the glass from being broken. Some helmets had a grille on the front as well. Stanley's showing you there that this helmet has a screw-in front light, and most did, but the American helmet I showed you before, they standardised on a hinged window light. So, and then finally, just there's a couple of eyelets on the top. The eyelets were used to take these hoses that ran off the comms and the air, and not those Stanley.
Sorry.
Yep, and just basically put a bit of light line through there and tie them off, so they went up over your head. And lastly, the hooks, which are here, hard to see, but hooks there, and the lines over the weights could go on there, and simply to hold the bonnet down, and I can sort of explain that maybe as we go through the weights. So they're the main features of a helmet, and in some ways they're all pretty much the same. You've got a different number of bolts, maybe a different number of lights, but otherwise the helmets work the same. And these are being used from 1840s through to, well, as Oliver just said, still now. We are aware that the Chinese Navy were using them regularly until just a few years ago, and that meant we could get supplies of certain things that they were making in China, and we can still get those, but in limited quantity. Or nowadays we really have to put our orders in, and when the factory gets enough, they'll switch over and make some. Just going back a second to this one here, as I said, this is sort of the iconic one. And in some ways, if you saw the first one they made in 1840s, it was very, very similar. It had wider shoulders, and the gentleman in America, Leon Lyons, actually has one of these, and I've seen his in person. Had wider shoulders, and spitcocks were non-existent, and of course comms were non-existent in 1840. But interestingly, pretty much as soon as the telephone was invented, they started putting comms in. And
Alan, you've muted yourself.
Yeah.
sorry, what
Sorry,
did you
Alan,
move?
looks like you've muted yourself. Yep, that's better.
Yep.
Sorry,
Yep. What did you move?
seconds or so.
So I was just saying about this helmet being very similar to the first one that was made in 1840s. So a few small differences, but look very much the same. Now, I'm going to look at some of the accessories, and I think the first one we're going to look at is the dress or dresses. We've got two here. So Stan will just show you this one. So a key thing is that when wearing this gear, you enter from the neck here, and this one's quite spacious, plenty of space to get in there. Otherwise, it acts fairly much like a dry suit. We have a cuff that seals around your wrist, and we have the enclosed foot down here. Stanley, I can't see if you take the other picture. So we have enclosed foot, as some dry suits have. So that's the main principle. So when you bolt that helmet with the brails that I showed earlier to that neck ring, then you get a total seal. And if you get wet, then something's wrong. We do get wet occasionally, but to dive, we normally just go to the wharf where we're doing our dives, and we go in our normal clothes and we get into these in our normal clothes. And we get out hopefully 100% dry, sometimes maybe a little wet at the collar or around the neck if there's some sort of a leak somewhere. Now I want to show you this. This one here is a Russian one. It goes with those 3-bolt helmets. One of the differences you can see is they've got a mitt enclosed, but the big difference, sorry, Stanley and I haven't practiced enough. So the mitt's enclosed versus having your hand open in the seawater. But the big difference I wanted to show you is this neck ring. So 3-bolt helmet, so it's got place for the 3 bolts to go through. But guess what? The diver still has to get through that hole. So his tenders, which are assistants, so your assistants are called tenders, they have to stand on that and stretch that apart big enough for the diver's hips and the diver's shoulders to get through there. And if you've ever seen any of those Russian divers, my goodness, they're big. We can move on to some of the other accessories. I'm just going to turn the phone around again. Sorry, jumps around a bit. And I'll talk about some of the boots. Interestingly, the pair in the middle, behind that is a pair of Russian boots, and I can put my foot in those with my joggers on and still wiggle it around freely. So if that's how big the Russian divers are, then they must have awful trouble getting in that suit. But let's look at the 3 set pairs of boots here. On the left, we've got a heavy pair of boots, which are full leather uppers, brass toe caps, and typically a lead sole with a wooden inner sole effectively over the top of it. So they are the heaviest sort of boot that you can get, and they weigh about 10 pounds each. Pounds, for those that know pounds, it's all right, but for those that want kilos, it's a little over 4.5 kilos. I didn't mention previously, but helmets, typically the full-sized English helmets, around about the 40 pounds. And the American one is slightly heavier as well. The European Russian one's probably slightly lighter because of the lesser brails. The boots in the middle, the uppers of those are made of canvas, and the American Navy had 2 standards. So they had a leather one similar to the one on the left, but they had these canvas ones which they called lightweight ones. So otherwise, pretty much the same. They've got brass toe caps and lead soles, and a little less heavy than the other ones. And that pair there is one that I actually used to dive in, so they're fully functional. But they did come with my American helmet, which I forgot to mention is a 1943 helmet. And so these are quite old boots, and we're still using them. I'm getting a little concerned about the leather, but I just tell everybody to be gentle. The ones on the right, they're not showing up too well in the dark down here, but they are from the English manufacturer C.B. Gorman, and they were called sandals. And basically the whole base of that boot is one piece of cast brass, and then with leather uppers. So that was their equivalent of a lightweight boot. I'm not sure how much lighter it really is. I guess brass might be a little lighter than lead, but that's it. I don't have any good pairs of those, but got a few pairs of similar ones. So now you've got a helmet weighing 40 pounds, you've got 2 boots weighing 10 pounds each. But guess what? There's so much air in those helmets that you still need more weight. Otherwise you float around like a cork, literally. So what we're going to look at now is some weights, and we'll start with the ones on the left. This is a pair of weights. Left one is a front weight, right one is a back weight. That's a pair of weights made by C.B. Gorman to go with their helmets. Again, they weigh about 40 pounds each. So just thinking of start adding all that up. Now moving over to this one in the middle, which is slightly smaller. There's a reason for that, and I haven't showed you any Asian helmets, but I can show you a couple here quickly. Probably won't notice much, but the typical Asian helmet was copied from the English style, C.B. Gorman style, 12 bolts, 3 lights. The only thing is, if it was next to one of the English ones, you'd notice that it was a little bit physically smaller. So particularly the bonnet is smaller, and therefore there's less air volume in it. That means that they can do with a little less weight. So you can see that one compared to the others. It's lighter. Can't tell you off the top of my head how much that is, but it's lighter than the other two, and you'd wear two similar ones with your Asian style helmet. Another point about the weight is, apart from counteracting the buoyancy of the helmet, you actually, talking to your military divers and commercial divers, you actually want the weight, because if what you're going to do is work, it's not recreational diving, you're going to work. And to do that, you need leverage. You need to be able to sort of anchor yourself on the bottom or whatever and be able to push or whatever you've got to do against something, and you can't do that if you're floating around. If you're floating around and push against somebody, you're going to be something that's fixed or hard to move, you're going to be the thing that moves. So you need that weight to give you that leverage. The last weight belt I'm going to show you here is the standard for the US Navy with their Mark V helmet. Stanley just lifting that up. Each one of those weights that he's just touching, there's 10, and they weigh 8 pounds each. On top of that, you've got a fairly substantial leather belt, leather straps, and brass buckles, giving you a weight of 83 or 85, something like that, pounds to go with that helmet. Again, the helmet itself is probably slightly larger in volume than the English one, so you need it for that, but as I said, also for doing the work. So that's the first bit of accessories. The next accessories we're going to look at is knives. We've got a range of knives here, and I've laid them out in a particular reason. So the ones here on the left, you've got two together. They are typical European style knives. Moving along to these ones. These are Russian knives, and you've got both a sheath type and a screw-in type, as the European ones were, and they had both. One here is the standard for the US Navy diving. It was a screw-in knife, and this is a modern made one, but it can still be made by the original manufacturers, Desco, Morse and so on. So that is what they used with that American helmet. Let's put it down, Sammy. And moving along to the English ones, I mentioned, in fact, two manufacturers, CB Gorman and Heinke. So the two on the left are CB Gorman knives. One is a sheath type knife, one is a screw-in, and the two on the right, both sheath type, actually basically the same, but they are both made by the Heinke company. Funnily enough, those names, CB Gorman and Heinke, were actually things like Austrian names and so on, but they were people that moved to the UK and lived there and had their businesses there. So we've covered the knives. Now I'm going to look at some of the smaller accessories, and just a quick look at those. You recall that let's turn around this way. You recall that the Russian dress had some built-in mitts. Well, these mitts here came with the US Navy helmet and its dress, and they're three-fingered mitts. So we can put them on the suit, but unfortunately they would fall off if that's all we did. So what we've got here are cuff rings. And the purpose of a cuff ring, it's two pieces. The dark piece at the back here goes inside the sleeve, and the part with the screw clamp goes on the outside and clamps the dress and the cuff together. Now, on the suits which had the cuff before, you saw the rubber cuffs, and you can stretch them apart, but there's also cuff expanders that were made. And the purpose of the cuff expander was to simply stick that inside the cuff, and your two tenders, I can't see if you take that as a picture.
Sorry.
Your tender would take it or two tenders and stretch it apart, allowing you to push your arm in. We typically don't have that problem. We use soap or personal lubricants to assist us to get our arms in. The final thing for the dress, for the English one, the US Navy one with the weight belt has basically got its own harness built into the weight belt. With the English ones, those weights hang off the helmet, off those hooks I mentioned before, and I said I'd say what they were for, but you could put the rope over the top of that. That will keep the helmet down. But you still need something extra, and we do that with a series of harness here. So there's your rope, goes over the top, as well as your weights. And also we add a belt, and the belt has a little attachment for the knife. So we'd wear that with the English gear. Last couple of items for that, we have a torch. Not as old, this has been in a later period when this gear was in use, because it takes 4 D cell batteries, but still quite an effective torch, quite a solid torch. And the box at the back here is a Japanese communications box. So you get round connections at the bottom. It actually has the ability to connect 4 divers, and then they spoke through a telephone. It was normally selected as to which diver you would speak to, or you speak to them all. With the diving systems, again, I'm speaking to the people that know, but the diver always has priority to speak. So the diver can speak, and the tender or supervisor at the surface will hear, and they will have to do something to override that and speak back. These early systems were basically a single wire, or it goes down and back, of course, you've got to have a circuit, but single wire, so it wasn't able to speak at the same time. It wasn't a duplex type system, it was one person at a time. Finally, the books. So the one on the left here was made by the C.B. Gorman Company, and they made many editions of that book over a long period of time, and that was really the diver's Bible back when people were diving this gear. So you'll see how thick this is. It's quite a lot of pages, and it covered everything, all of the gear, all of the associated gear, decompression, salvage, all sorts of things. By contrast, this slightly thinner one is a US Navy diving manual of 1916, and it's significant because, as I said, that's the year that this Mark V helmet was introduced as their standard. So this actual book covers both some helmets that they had been using prior to that, prior to standardising, and then the Mark V helmet. So that was their diving manual for the Navy. So basically, just thinking about that, this gear was all used from 1840s, and this is deep sea gear, right through, as I said, US Navy to the mid 80s. Australian Navy, admittedly, was one of the earliest ones out, and they got out of it pretty much straight after World War II. The shallow water helmets didn't exist in the early time. The one I mentioned, third from the left, came in about 1920s and was made for some years and overlapped the next model. And so most of those are things that were done in the 1920s to 1940s. And so then we got to World War II, and as you probably know, we had Cousteau and Gagnon working on scuba, but things went off in a couple of different directions, not just to scuba. So after World War II, commercial diving changed as well. So people started making helmets out of fiberglass. And this helmet here is a Swindell, and it is a very early fiberglass helmet. It was the same in the sense that the air was still supplied from the surface, and it still used a slightly different way, but it was still enclosed. So you had a neck dam to enclose it. There was actually a version of this, I don't have it, but there was actually a version where it had a breastplate which was made out of fiberglass. So imagine those copper breastplates you saw over there. That helmet could be sitting on a blue fiberglass, one of those. This particular helmet has a welding lens, so presumably it was used for welding at some stage. And in fact, I have another one from the C.B. Gorman somewhere, which is not on a helmet, but they had them as well. So that was one way they went. Commercial diving gear actually and often kept the concept of surface supplied and using different materials, being fiberglass and stainless steel for the helmet versus the copper and brass. Surprisingly, this helmet is one of the heaviest I've got because this whole bottom part here is a real solid piece of stainless steel. And then, of course, we also had rubber and neoprene being introduced. And so if we look at this helmet here, this is called Desco Jack Brown. Again, it was designed to be surface supplied, and there is, in fact, two connections here. So we can actually have surface supplied and a bailout bottle, or you could have actually switched off the surface supply connection and had a scuba supply and do your diving in that. So quite multi-purpose type of unit. No head protection on that one, of course, because it's not a hard hat, but quite a useful piece of equipment. And they were made from around late World War II onwards. And then we come to this one, and this one is from a company called Kirby Morgan. Kirby Morgan went out and made a lot of this type of gear, and their company doesn't exist as Kirby Morgan anymore, but it's been bought out, and I think it's Diving Systems International is the current company. But Kirby and Morgan were two gentlemen that made it. They made a lot of different models. This is called a band mask for a simple reason that you've got it held on by a band. The front part here is fiberglass, but the back is just wetsuit neoprene type material. It's designed for both surface supply and also to have a bailout or scuba again if you wanted. So you've got both options, but unlike the other one that we've looked at so far, here we have a demand regulator, second stage regulator built into it. So you've got all of that flexibility in one device. They actually made versions also where they put a hard hat part. It's a clamshell, I think they called it, which is a separate fiberglass part that went over and covered this part of your head. So it didn't really change this, but it went under there and gave you more head protection. Some of these things have little nose squeezers, which you'll see these are. So from there, they've actually, Stanley brought over his modern helmet. They've gone on and made many more models, and we now have models like
57.
Sorry?
So KMB 57.
KMB 57. So going back to this one, this is actually a military version of the KMB 10, and this is a 57. So a lot of time in between there, and a lot of models. Now from there, moving on, we had this company here, and this is made by.
Alan,
Yes?
sorry, just before we move on, I just had a question. Oliver just wanted to go back to the type of helmet that the blue one is. Could you just
So,
clarify the blue one for us?
Swindell, SWINDELL.
There you go. Oliver, did that answer that?
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Thanks, mate. Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, not made anymore. Swindell being, again, the guy's name that created them, and it doesn't exist anymore, and they were early, so I'm not sure, probably 60s or about in the 60s they were made. The actual US Navy made a version as well of that helmet and had some side lights and some differences, but they took that design. So just moving on, as I say, this is made by a company called Scott. Scott were into things like breathing devices, firefighting, aeroplanes, actually for devices for the pilots and so on to breathe. So they made this one, and I'm showing it. It was used a little bit commercially, but not talking about your serious commercial, oil diving or whatever, but probably lesser jobs working on bottom of boats, piers and wharves and things like that. It has a couple of unique features, or one in particular is top part here. I don't know if you can see I'm turning that. That's actually a snorkel. So when it's in that position, on the surface you can breathe without using your air supply, and before you descend you need to do it up and then mid off your supply. Now, could have been surface supply, but typically was supplied as a scuba unit, first stage and second stage, and that's another feature that's a bit different where it comes in on the side. So the air comes in on this side and exhausts on this side, which means of course you're getting the air flowing across your face, which you need to do to get the fresh air. So that's one that's just, I guess, a little different to the others. Before we go on to some of the scuba gear, I'll show you this other one that Stanley brought over tonight. This is a helmet that was made in limited production. It's more of a, I guess, collectible, unique item rather than a used for diving item, although Stanley does dive it. But it was made by Phil Newton, who's fairly famous in the diving world. And it was modelled after the Abyss helmet. So it's not one of the Abyss helmets, but it's similar to the Abyss movie helmet. Okay, so as I said, diving went off in a couple of directions. So we've just had a look at how sort of helmet and commercial diving continued after the brass copper era, but also, of course, as we know, went off to scuba. And while I'm just there, this backpack is from Scott. So that goes with that last mask I showed you as a tank holder backpack. But you all know, of course, the story of Cousteau, and less people know about his offsite at Gagnon. So Gagnon was an engineer, and Cousteau, I guess, was the concepts person and the keen diver, and he wanted to explore the depths. And so with Gagnon, he created a scuba system. And what I've got here is a combination. So this tank here, the twin tanks, is actually an early Cousteau Gagnon tank. It's the original model, made in the second year of production, 1946, and came to me from a person who was German and emigrated to Australia and brought it with him. Now, it would have been used with a twin hose. I don't have a twin hose of the same vintage, but generally they all looked very similar, like this. So we have all of our regulator done in one canister here, which sits on top of the tank, and it's supplied to, sorry, just push something on my screen. It's supplied to the diver through the hose, right? So there's no first stage at your mouth, everything done back here. So to do that, typically in the early days there wasn't probably a standard, but in the let's turn it over for a reason. In the later days, I guess it was standardized, and the air would flow from your tank this way into the mouthpiece, and you would exhale and it would flow back here and be vented out through these holes. Now, still a great idea, and there are modern ones now used for photography, because you don't have the bubbles coming up in front of you and the camera and scaring the fish. So that's a great thing, but it does make things a little different. First of all, there is a non-return valve here. Otherwise, water could flow back, flood your hose, and you suck on it, all you get is water. There's also a couple of standard ways of clearing that hose if it did happen. One of them was simply to stretch stretch the hose up above your head, where the sort of water pressure would be lower than where the actual regulator is. So this is controlling the pressure, and therefore effectively free flow, and that would clear out the hose. So you would stretch it up, let the air come out and push the water out, turn it down so it held all the air in, then quickly slip it into your mouth and spit out the rest. The other way was to do a roll, a horizontal roll, where you would lift your right shoulder up so that this would go up, there would run as you rolled around, there would go to the top all the time. When you're upside down, it would be there, and it pushed all the water out, and you'd be able to breathe. So I'm very pleased to actually have been given those tanks. Quite a bit of diving history there. Just moving on, of course, you'll all be aware of the single hose two-stage system that we use today. And I'll just move things around a bit. I don't know if you'll be aware that this was actually invented by an Australian. And I say invented, around the world there are a lot of people experimenting and doing things, but he was an inventor, an engineer, and he was the first person to mass produce these. There's actually a book which has been written by some of the members of our society about Ted Eldred as the inventor and the actual system that he invented and how it happened and what happened. And we actually have just done a 4th reprint of that book, primarily to order for people, but there's a few copies left, which Carmen will let you know about later if you're interested. And this here is a page from the book, and it's a timeline of the inventions. So going back to 1949, so we're talking only a few years after Cousteau and Gagnon produced that system that I showed you a minute ago, he started making systems, and this is using just a standard gas regulator, same sort of thing you'd use on a welding system. So he started with that as his first stage, and then he moved on and started making dedicated systems. And we come through the timeline here, and we'll get to this one. This was his universal first stage, and that is actually that one there, universal first stage. And that was made from there right through to the end of that company, and went with a number of other second stage regulators. So we've got one here, second stage regulator that was used with that, and that's this one. And then there was this one here, and then finally this one, which is that one there. So as you can see, it says porpoise. A bit of a sad story that he was making very, very good quality gear. This one, apparently, he made at a price point rather than quality point, and he was never happy with that regulator. But for all the rest, he always made it for high quality and just to be the best. But unfortunately, La Spira Technique, which was the company created by Cousteau and Gagnon that manufactured these, they weren't too happy and pretty much said, either sell us your company or we're going to flood the market with cheap twin hoses and you'll never sell anything again. So that's really what happened. He gradually sold the company, and the Spira Technique basically shut it down. Went for a while, but then they shut it down, and that was the end of that. But really, this is really still what we dive with today, and that was started by an Australian in 1949, and we've got things that would be fairly recognisable that were made in the 50s by Ted Eldred and his company. So I'm getting towards the end now. I'm throwing in my 1973. This is my personal knife that I bought in 1973, and can't believe the quality versus the quality nowadays. But you know what they say. That's not a knife. This is a knife. So fantastic stainless steel, 1973 knife. And that really brings me to the end of my presentation. I have a lot more gear. Not all that's in this room. I set this room up. Oh, I did miss this one. When you're diving with a helmet, it can be quite painful on the shoulders. So that's a US Navy shoulder pad which you wear under a helmet. But I've got quite a lot more gear. It's just, I've got more band masks, more full face masks. I've got more twin hose, more early scuba. I've got 25 helmets that you can see there's a second row going right along behind the lounge chair. And there's been some in the house because there isn't room here. And some of them, I like to have a couple in the house just to see. So that's about it. I've got over 1,000 books on diving. I've got hundreds of images, original images, many hundreds. I've got DVDs, some are legitimate, some are not, but lots of diving movies, diving shows, and multiple boots, multiple helmets, diving dresses in plastic bags, all sorts of things. So that is about it from me, unless anybody has some questions.
Thank you so much, Alan. Does anybody out there have a question? Do you just want to pop, if you do pop a question in the chat, just say, I have a question in the chat, and I'll unmute you. Anyone? I think you were so thorough, Alan. I think you've covered everything pretty well. Yeah.
Probably a lot more that could be said, but
No, you've done an amazing job. It's super interesting. And guys, I just have to point out how much effort has gone to get all this. A lot of this gear is really heavy, and he sort of set it all out to make this really easy. So that's really, really awesome. Could you just tell us a little bit more, Alan, about the Historic Diving Society and just a little bit more about what you guys do, basically? Yep.
So Historical Diving Society, Australia Pacific I'm talking about. I'll switch back to, basically, this is us here. We are an historical diving society. There are a number of them around the world, the US, UK, various European countries, but we're the local one. There's no direct link. I mean, some people have said, oh, are you a subsidiary or whatever? No, we're just people with like interests. So we specialise, I guess, in our own history of being primarily Australia and New Zealand, but whatever, if our interests take us outside of that, we do that. We have one group that's interested in some of the Russian gear, for example. One of the reasons for that is the gear is still fairly readily available. It's a bit cheaper than some of the other stuff, so they like to do that. But we, I guess we do a number of things. The main things we do, we produce a quarterly journal, and that journal will have research stories that people have researched, aspects of the history of diving. It'll have reports on restoring equipment, on diving events, and I must say we're not a diving organisation, but many of our members dive in this gear, and we organise our own little dives and we advertise them through the society. So we'll do that in our quarterly magazine. We also have a monthly electronic bulletin which comes out, which I produce. I don't produce the magazine, and that's really just to keep a little bit more, I guess, up to date. So every month, letting people know what's coming up or what has just happened and reporting on what's just happened. So we'll pump that out every month. Then I guess the other things we do, as I said, the diving events and so on, although they're not society events, they are publicised exclusively to our members. We actually have we have an association with the Commercial Diving School I was talking about earlier. They're a combination of commercial diving company, commercial diving school, and also recreational diving in a regional town in our state of Victoria. And they run for us every year an annual certification course, which is a NAUI certification to dive the standard dress. And in association with that, anybody that's already qualified, we have a rally. So we've had typically about 30 people do that in recent years as the numbers have built up with more and more qualified. And then we also have people like my wife and other people's partners and even children will go along, and it's become a big diving and social event. Unfortunately, of course, the virus will kill that this year. Kill it. It's normally held in the second, sort of the second Monday in June in many Australian states is the Queen's birthday weekend. So it's a long weekend, and it's normally held over that weekend, which gives us 3 days of diving. But we normally arrive the day before, have social event, and we stay the full 3 days and head off the day after. So it's sort of a 5-day investment, given that it takes a fair bit of time to get there. Apart from that, I think they are the main things. We actually have a special offer. I'll pass on to Carmen. We've got a special offer for people that sign up now. The price for membership, I think, is very reasonable. It's 50 Australian dollars, which is not worth a lot these days, but 50 Australian dollars will get you all those things, including the 4 printed copies of the journal mailed to you every year. And yeah, so that's it. It's sort of a place for like-minded people that are interested in the history of diving, people that are interested in collecting the equipment, people that are interested in restoring the equipment, and people that are interested in diving the equipment. I mean, you don't have to want to do all of those, but any of those will line you up with people with like interests.
Fantastic. And Liv actually has just mentioned to me about offering, is it a course to dive in the gear? Is that what you were referring to with the diving event?
Yeah. Normally there is a course once a year in, sorry, I don't know who asked you. Is it somebody from Australia or?
That was Liv has actually mentioned that one.
Oh.
So yeah.
So it's a course that's held in Portland, which is a regional town in Victoria. It's about 4 hours drive west of Melbourne. It's much closer to the South Australian border than it is to Melbourne. But yeah, it's held on that Queen's birthday weekend every June, except this one. Would have been, I think, our 12th year of having a formal course, but and prior to that, people were going down there and diving. But this one will be cancelled, unfortunately.
Absolutely understood. No, that's amazing. And just one more thing. So just to come back to the book, that's currently in its 4th edition, The Porpoise, isn't it?
Yep. One.
That's it. So that book there, guys, if anybody wants a copy of that, we're actually going to stick temporarily, we'll stick a product on the online store so that if anybody would like to buy one, we can order those for you and send them straight directly to you as well. We'll ship them out. If you want one, Oliver, over there, I'll ship you one over there as well. So what we'll do is we'll put that on the online store. Look, thank you so much, Alan, so much, and Stanley as well for your presentation today. Super interesting, and I'm so happy that I actually got to see this presentation this time, because last time, unfortunately, I drew the short straw and had to run the shop. See, everybody else wanted to see that. So
you missed out diving in the gear.
I know. I had to enjoy the photos of everybody else doing it. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. It was super interesting. A couple of comments in the chat just about how amazing your collection is, and that it's very interesting to see where it's all started. So big thank you to you for that. In terms of this presentation will be available by recording. So we will get that recording prepared in the next couple of days, and that'll be able to be watched on YouTube. And we will put the links up on socials and with the recording in the next day as well. Links to the website with where to go for memberships, and also you've got the group as well. I think the Facebook group too, from memory. Is that correct?
Facebook group, yeah.
Yep, great. I think that's about everything for today. Does anyone else have any last questions? No, I think we're good. Well, thank you everyone so much for coming along today. Really appreciate it. And it's great to see all your regular faces coming back and joining these webinars. So that's fantastic. Any questions afterwards for Alan, still feel free to reach out and we'll happily get those through to him.